and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm Nora. Joining me in the studio today is David Mathieson, an independent analyst working on conflict and human rights issues in Myanmar. Thank you for joining me. We're approaching 4 years since the 2021 military coup on February 1st. Back in October 2023, the battlefield dynamic shifted with the launch of Operation 1027 by the Three Brotherhood Alliance. How has the anti-coup resistance benefited from this?
I think what Operation 1027 did was it was a real thunderclap into a conflict in which people were starting to prematurely call it a stalemate. Basically saying, no one's really winning. And I think what Operation 1027 really demonstrated was that a coalition, an alliance of various armed groups could plan something over a long period of time that had very important military but also political and strategic aims around it, and really fundamentally changed the dynamic of the conflict, and to keep it secret. I think that's really one of the things that came out of Operation 1027 was not just the military prowess, the logistics, and the planning, it was also the operational security that they could pull off. And how well that they cooperated with allies, like the Burma People's Liberation Army, the People's Liberation Army from the Bakapa, Mandalay PDF, and many others. I think that there's lots of really important lessons to take, both from Operation 1027, the first phase, and the second phase. I think it really fundamentally changed the direction of the conflict.
Last January, China brokered a ceasefire between the military regime in Naypyidaw and Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army and the Aung National Liberation Army. This broke down in June and Operation 1027 continued. But a few months ago, both called for more peace talks. Why hasn't the regime responded?
I think the regime hasn't responded. The Sakasa knows full well that these peace talks are an illusion. They're basically just a form of negotiating strategy. They're not really about seeking peace. And because the regime and Min Aung Hlaing are not serious about peace. They want to hold on to power. And I think that the EAOs going to China, and even the Chinese know this very well, that it's really not about securing a peace. It's about manipulating each other. And if you look at the Hlaing Agreement and that more than a year of discussions and then some of the recent meetings, I think when you step back from it, the idea that China is calling all the shots here and is kind of influencing all of the players is I think, seriously misplaced. It shows that China doesn't really have that much influence over both the Sakasa and the EAOs. I mean, it can exert a lot more pressure over the TNLA and the MNDAA and many others, but not to a 100% degree. China was probably very unhappy that the MNDAA took over Lashio. The MNDAA is still in Lashio and they're still administering Lashio. So I think we've got to kind of readjust our perceptions of how influential China really is and what the purpose of these peace talks really are.
In November, regime leader Min Aung Hlaing visited China for the first time since the 2021 coup. It wasn't a state visit since he didn't travel to Beijing nor did he meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. But what did he achieve with this visit? Does it help legitimize his rule?
I think initially there was a lot of commentary and analysis that this showed that China had control over Min Aung Hlaing and that they were rewarding him in some way. I really wouldn't see it as that. It was a pretty relatively eventless visit. He went for some regional summits, most of which are just purely symbolic. And then I think probably the most important thing he did was visit some UAV drone factories and probably secured some kind of further military assistance in that way. But there's another way of looking at it, which is this was a snub. It was Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership kind of going, we don't like what you're doing and we think you're an inept buffoon. And so you get to come, but only to Yunnan and visit some summits, maybe have some side meetings with various people. But in terms of, China didn't roll out the red carpet for Min Aung Hlaing. In fact, it rolled out kind of the tattered, nasty carpet. And it's like, you're in power, we have to deal with you, but we don't necessarily like it. That's how I would see it.
Yeah. Regime Foreign Minister and Deputy Minister, Prime Minister Kyaw Zaw was in Bangkok last month to present plans for its election this November. Thailand's Foreign Minister even seemed to endorse this plan. Cambodia said it would send election observers. How did other countries in the region react? Are they planning to support this election plan?
I don't think anyone's particularly ardently supportive of these elections. I think that there's a widespread exhaustion with the regime and with Min Aung Hlaing, and now with elections coming, I think that there's a fairly resigned perception that maybe this is something, maybe that we can get some momentum out of this. But I think it's also tempered with concerns that it could be a very violent process. Now, the idea that there's going to be elections because of a democratic process is totally misplaced, utterly absurd. No one should take that seriously. When you're asking for election monitors from Cambodia, which had one of the most fraudulent elections in Southeast Asian history, just a couple of years ago, it's pretty bizarre. And I don't think that any of the neighbouring countries from Myanmar are taking this seriously as a getting out of the conflict process. I think it's just, maybe there's something here that we can grab onto. And I think that they need to be persuaded differently, that this could actually be a trigger for further violence. And that what the elections are trying to paper over is that there has been a violent reordering of Myanmar in Rakhine and Kachin and in northern Shan and in the southeast as well, and ongoing in Anya, of revolutionaries actually taking over parts of the country and trying to administer it in a different way. That's a reality that I don't think ASEAN really wants to face up to. And elections aren't going to stop that. In fact, that they could actually make things worse.
Yeah. Does this election plan fit with the 5-point consensus ASEAN agreed in 2021?
Even if you were an amazing gymnast, you couldn't contort the elections into the 5-point consensus. But I don't think that's going to stop people from trying. And I think that the 5-point consensus is so dead in the water, face down, going nowhere, but yet people still want to revive it and make it somehow relevant. I don't think that there's any point in that anymore. The big issue to me is not so much what regional countries are going to say about the elections and about the 5-point consensus. I think that we can see through the frustrations and the hypocrisy of Cambodia and the other members of ASEAN. The big concern to me is what the international community, the Western international community, is going to do, because they've been quiet on this. And I don't think we should be assuming that that the West, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, and the European Union are going to completely dismiss the elections. I think the concern is that they might see that there is something in this as well. There's a lot of incredibly bad ideas within the diplomatic community in Yangon and in Bangkok and in Western capitals that they don't necessarily like what they're seeing, and they're hearing all of this fragmentation, balkanization, and all these other really stupid characterizations of what's happening in Myanmar. And they're fearing that disorder. And so they might actually think, well, an election, it's not really going to be democracy, but it might be something. It could be a transition plan, or one of those utterly ridiculous diplomatic terms that they use, like off-ramp and other things. That's my concern. I mean, I think if you have a cynical bent in your analysis, you understand where China and the members of ASEAN are coming from. But it's the West that I think will betray the revolution first. Yeah.
You've recently published a story in the Asia Time online newspaper questioning claims of territorial control made by the National Unity Government. It's called Myanmar's NUG Cooks the Books on Resistance Success. Could you share why you wrote this?
I think it was really about reading the report and at first thinking that it was good that the National Unity Government, the Ministry of Defence, had produced a report like this. And I thought this is a good part of transparent governance. Mm-hmm. And then reading it a second time, I thought, well, you're at first claiming things in a very kind of subtle way that the resistance did this. And it made me think, well, no, the Arakan Army did that. Mm-hmm. And that was the Kachin Independence Organisation that did that. And if you add up all of these towns that they're talking about, and then further down they claim, well, of the 95 or whatever towns, the National Unity Government only took 11 of them. Mm-hmm. Well, that's dishonest. That's not saying these are the various organisations that took over this territory. And I also think that there's I think there's questions to be made about the term revolutionary and the term ERO. Mm-hmm. That a lot of these ethnic armed organisations mm-hmm. were revolutionary before the coup. Mm-hmm. They were revolutionary decades mm-hmm. before the National Unity mm-hmm. Government. Mm-hmm. And also I think it's got to be said that the National League for Democracy's element within the National Unity Government, mm-hmm. I think a lot of EAOs remember several years ago during the peace process that the mm-hmm. NLD was really dismissive of their revolutionary aspirations. And it's not like a coup suddenly evaporates these sentiments. And so I thought it was important to a certain extent, not really that important, to kind of challenge some of the claims here. And because I don't think you win a revolution by not giving credit where it's due. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't really understand the National Unity Government's disinclination to kind of say, you know what, the MNDAA did that. Mm-hmm. The Aung National Liberation Army did that. The Karen National Union, mm-hmm. yeah. who we consider to be an ally and we respect, they did that. And it's the Karen people that are doing all the suffering. It's Rakhine people that are doing all the suffering. I don't think that the people who draft these reports necessarily understand that it's creating a certain kind of ill feeling. But then I was speaking to some Myanmar friends the other night about it, and we were trying to discuss whether leaders of some of the ethnic armed organisations, of EROs, whatever you want to call them, whether they would read that MOD report and get angry. And we speculated that no, actually, I think a lot of the EAO leaders that planned Operation 1027 are so busy fighting a huge war against an incredibly ruthless enemy, the Sakasa and the Sitat, that if they even saw that report, they'd be like, oh, who cares? Like, we've got bigger things to deal with here. And so I think that's the biggest lesson, is that, why would the NUG put out a report like that when, one, it's not completely true, and two, it kind of makes them look a little bit silly when you understand the gravity of what the EAOs are actually doing. So yeah, they were cooking the books. They were basically rearranging data and facts, and I think that there's way too much of that going on in Myanmar right now.
Have you received any pushbacks from NUG supporters?
No, I mean, I saw what Kyaw Zaw said. I don't think he necessarily understood my article, and I don't think he really understands the NUG report. And no, I mean, I would be very happy to engage in any kind of debate with the National Unity Government. Sure. I think, if anything, one of their shortcomings is that they don't encourage more open debate and open criticism. And I think that they're a very immature political movement, that they don't welcome people trying to justifiably criticise them, but also offer ways for them to improve their behaviour. The one thing that the NUG, I think, is a very uneven political project. There's some really good things that different parts of the NUG are doing, and then there's some absolutely terrible things. And yet they still have this very immature political culture of just not wanting to hear any bad news. And that is not a government, in my view. Governments should be welcoming bad news so that they can readjust their approaches.
Do you think separating achievements like this helps clarify how effective the NUG is overall, or does it make things more confusing?
No, I think it should ideally provide some clarity. And it should, I think, add to debates about what the NUG needs to do to improve its performance. And you can be a critic of the NUG, but want it to succeed. And that's where I am. I do not want the NUG to fail. I want them to succeed. I want them to get rid of the Sakasa. And yet there is a frustration that I hear amongst lots of Myanmar friends that the NUG is not pursuing the correct reforms in order to achieve that. And one of them has to be, and there have been analysts and commentators and advisors and many people for the past 2.5, 3 years recommending to the NUG what it needs to do to have a more effective warfighting strategy. It needs stronger command and control. It needs to unify all of these different PDFs in the Anya region. You can't stage a coherent military operation when you've got 30 distinct small PDFs. It really shows that they need to do more. And to their credit, the NUG has tried to pursue some of this. They have done some pretty important reforms, but they need to do a lot more. And so I do think it is one way of looking at how the conflict is going by saying, well, that group did that, that group did that. And I don't think it confuses it any further, because the situation's already very confusing. And I think what's needed is clarity.
It seems like very few people are willing to criticize claims made by the NUG and other resistant groups. How do you think they handle criticism?
Not very well at all. And lots of people, in my view, do criticise the NUG. They just do it in private. And I think that's the problem, that there's not that many people willing to speak out in a constructive way, hopefully. And for too long, I've heard way too many foreigners who are close to the NUG saying you shouldn't criticise them, they're doing their best. And it's like, well, they should be actually trying to do better. It's a revolution, it's not a committee. And that's been the problem, I think, that there are way too many wet, pathetic Westerners who are advising the NUG and the NUCC and telling them that they're great and they're doing such a fantastic job, when clearly they're not. And I think a lot of these foreigners are the problem. Overpaid morons who are actually giving bad advice and are actually injecting a political culture in the NUG of not taking any criticism and demonising anyone that dares to criticise them. And what the NUG fully understands, I think, is that there is a lot of frustration, anger towards them, and a lot of Myanmar people who want them to do better. But they're not. I don't think the NUG should pay any attention to what I have to write or say at all. Who they need to listen to is the Myanmar people. And I come up with these ideas not because they pop out of my head, it's because I listen to lots of Myanmar friends who tell me this, and then I write it because I think it's from where I come from, criticising a government, even one that you might support, is a duty in many ways. It's an obligation, especially for a free press or from academia or from average people. You should be able to criticise your government. I don't understand why Myanmar political culture doesn't welcome that, when in fact, quietly, you hear criticism of the NUG wherever you go in Myanmar circles. And I think that whether it's DVB or other parts of the Myanmar media, you all should be a lot more critical publicly of them as well. If they claim to be a government, treat them like one, and be critical of bad things that they do.
Since you closely monitor the conflict in Myanmar, it seems that each year the regime increasingly relies on airstrikes to losses on the battlefield. Now, Rakhine State is the latest target with over 40 killed in one village on Ramri Island on January 8th. Do you see the regime retaliating more fiercely than before?
I think it depends on the time frame there. I think over the past year and a half, we've seen them rely on airstrikes more and more. In the past few months, I think what we've seen is more direct strikes against civilian targets. But even then, you can say over the past year they've been doing that, whether it's Kukai, Chalkmay, or parts of Rakhine, but also parts of lots of parts of Anya and Kachin and others. It's very hard, stepping back and trying to look beyond. The excellent work that Nyanlin Analytica and Data for Myanmar have been doing and looking at the airstrikes, and it is really fantastic work. But one thing that's missing, I think, is where is the strategy of the Myanmar Air Force? And if it's Vice Senior General So Win that's directing some of this, what part of the grand strategy is to say, okay, obviously bombing the insurgents, bombing the Arakan army or bombing the KIA, that's not working. Let's just kill civilians. And that seems to be part of their strategy, to demoralise the population. But then the population's been going through this for more than 3 years. And so just intensifying it is just murder without any purpose. Because if it's a strategy to try and stop resistance, it's not working. The concern is that we're seeing far more drone strikes, and we might see more of that in the future, unfortunately, because the nature of the conflict has just been changing on all fronts. If you look at the way the war is being fought now, it's fundamentally different to what it was 3 years ago. And I think it will continue to change, and airstrikes will be a major part of that. And the other thing I would say on that is that the ban on jet fuel and the ban on arms sales just hasn't been effective in Myanmar. All of these international measures are symbolically very, very important, but materially ineffective.
The Arakan army has 3 remaining townships in Rakhine State, where it is fighting the regime over control. How will this affect Chinese, Indian, and other international investments in the region?
I think it will fundamentally change them, because you will find that all of these various investors and nation states may very well soon have to deal with a different partner, one that is not based in Naypyidaw, but is based in Pangshang up in northern Shan State. And that, I think, is going to dramatically reshift the notion of sovereignty and the notion of economic agreements. When you have an armed group that controls the Bangladesh border, that's really quite significant. And large parts of the Indian border, including the Kaladan River, in which India has long-standing investments. Also, all of these major investments in central Rakhine that are now surrounded, in some cases occupied by the Arakan army. It means that the Chinese now have to directly talk to the Arakan army about keeping all of these economic investments running. The Arakan army, the United League of Arakan, numerous times has actually said that it will guarantee all of these investments. And so I think people should be thinking of a future in which there's going to be multiple parties to economic contracts who all have to be consulted in various ways, and that there could be some semblance of a Sarkisar administration in Chalkpyu, but actually everywhere else they've got to deal with the United League of Arakan government. And we could be seeing that far more in other parts of the country, in Kachin and in northern Shan as well, and even in parts of central Myanmar. I think the more that people understand these realities, and that's what they are, it's not just a temporary blip. These are new realities that have to be faced up to on the part of China and India and Bangladesh and the rest of the world, quite frankly.